Alright, hello everybody, it's Jonathan again. You're going to be hearing some weird ruffling. Basically, for this radio broadcast, I am recording, in the cupboard. That's right, I am sitting amongst my coats. Basically, I got the idea. I don't know if any of you guys watch Game Theory, but the guy who makes the stuff called Matt Pat or Matthew Patrick mentioned that when he's doing this sort of sound recording, one of the best ways to, muffle out echoes and background noises and the rest is to record in a coat cupboard, so I thought I'd give it a try. Anyway, the topic of today's broadcast will be about dual wielding. I'm going to be talking about using two weapons or two items at the same time in various different contexts and different types of situations and different combinations, of course. Now, it's worth mentioning this is mostly in relation to a lot of talks that have been done recently, especially on the YouTube channel Scholar Gladiatoria, hosted by an expert historical European martial artist known as Matt Easton. Now, one of the things that was raised in the talks was basically looking at certain styles like using a sword and an axe or two axes, or that one thing that I'd actually posted a video about was using two shields at the same time. Now, it's worth mentioning that whenever we're talking about dual wielding, it always comes the caveat that it's not really something that was done a lot. I know when you're looking at things like fancy television and such things, you'd imagine, even if not on a battlefield, at least in dueling, people would be using two weapons at the same time quite a bit, right? But it seems not. The closest we ever get to that is the obvious combination of some sort of weapon and shield. So of course there are plenty of examples, even in artwork, in references, in different texts, and all sorts of places, where people have used weapons such as swords, maces, axes, spears, you name it, with, of course, shields. However, when it comes to having two weapons, one of the first things I should mention is that most commonly, rather than what you see on television, where a person might say, be dual-wielding axes, or knives, or swords, having two almost identical, or actually identical items, what we usually see works best in terms of using two weapons is to have them uneven. For example, I could have something like, this was something mentioned in Matt's video, as in Matt Easton's video, not Matthew Patrick, that you actually can have something like a defensive item, such as a sword, maybe a basket-hilted sword especially, so something that's really good for parrying and that sort of thing, in your offhand, such as your left hand if you're right-hand dominant, and then something that's primarily offensive, like a fighting axe, in your dominant hand, in my case the right hand. But there are other combinations that are interesting to use as well. One obvious combination that you could call, I tend to call the pirate combination, is to have a projectile weapon and a close combat weapon, so in this case having something like a saber, hanger or cutlass in your main hand, so you can fend for yourself, you can provide defense and offense, parry, riposte, do all those things, but in your offhand you have a pistol. And apart from the fact that you can, of course, just point it at someone and shoot them from a distance, there are many tactical options you could get from a projectile weapon as well. You can, of course, threaten someone. So one of the things I'd do, if I had something like a sword and a pistol, is not necessarily fire off the thing immediately like you see in the movies, and actually deliberately use it in close combat. So I would be there, maybe a person is staying back, or they're actually rather aggressive, and I can point it at them. I'm literally showing, hey look, I've got this gun, I can shoot you in the face with it. Do you want that to happen? And then, just as much as you can do a feint, a pretend attack, or you can maybe feign a retreat, or do tactics like that, to say, oh look, come and attack me bro, come get me, you could do that with a pistol. So in that sense, you could, again, you're pointing a pistol and you're saying, look, I can shoot you at this range, and at which point that forces them to think, whoa, if I'm not quick, I'm going to get shot. So they'll either maybe be scared and run away and think, crap, I don't want to get shot in the face, I'm out of here, which is good. Or surrender, of course, hands in the air, do that sort of thing. Or, of course, just goad them into attacking. So you say, look, I'm pointing this pistol at you, so then you know their next move is they're going to charge in and try to attack. So when you know what your opponent's next move is, you can then do something to riposte to it. So you could maybe prepare a hanging guard, and then you parry with that, and then riposte. And with a right-hand dominant foe, you can probably imagine they're going to be swinging that sword from the right, either with a sort of a horizontal strike, a diagonal strike, or a vertical strike. Not very often do people lead with an attack from their offside. For example, someone right-handed attacking and swinging from the left, or indeed from under. It can happen, and it's worth watching out for, and thrusts especially is something that will be quite often used as well, but at least you've got some degree of predictability. So there we are, without even firing the pistol, without using it for parrying or doing any fancy stuff like that, just pointing it at someone could be an unloaded gun for all you know, and yet it still has a useful effect as a second weapon, because then you're making your opponent become predictable. So hence we follow up with the idea that actually, different weapons are better than identical weapons. If you've got just two swords, you're not really twice as effective. You can parry a bit better, but you're able to do things like lunge forward and rotate your body in. Let's say I'm pushing my right shoulder forward and I'm striking my right arm. I'm not going to be able to follow up with my left hand quite as easily, unless I'm sort of evened out, sort of shoulders fairly equal and using more jabbing motions, but that starts to restrict what kinds of movements I can do. Because then it becomes a bit like using something like sword and buckler, where I can be using the items to fight around each other in a tighter space, as in a tighter action on my hands, rather than something like two-handed sword, where I'd commit my body, deliver my shoulders and my hips, and my footwork all forward, so it might start with my left in front, and then lunge forward, so my right's in front, with a passing step as we call it, and strike in powerfully. I'm instead keeping my left and right arms sort of fairly close to each other in front, dancing around with it, and doing quicker, more nimble strikes. But at the same time, if you have uneven weapons, such as perhaps a sword and an axe, or perhaps a sword and something unusual like a sickle, or even something like a lantern, at that point I can be using the different items for different purposes. Perhaps one item's better for defense. Maybe it's something that covers a larger area, something like a basket hilt that covers your hands and protects you, keeps your arms safe and whatnot. Or it could be something really offensive. You could have something like a spear in one hand, or perhaps have something like a good old dagger in one hand that's good in close range. So then you're using the advantages and the disadvantages to equal each other out. And that's one of the reasons why you see something like a sword and dagger quite often used when it comes to things like rapiers, because you can stick that rapier or basket hilt weapon in front of you, so you've got your hands protected, so you're getting good at distance. But then if your opponent charges in to a range where they could be grappling with you, disarming you, throwing you, slamming you to the ground, that sort of thing, normally you've got to be using the pommel of your weapon, maybe try to manipulate your opponent around and do some sort of draw cut at range, or of course take all that time to pull weapon back for a tight-in thrust. Or, with something like a knife in your offhand, of course you can just do close range stabbing, or even cutting if you so desire. So at that point, your options open up, and your opponents don't have that advantage anymore. Maybe someone who's unarmed might think, aha, that man has a sword, take their chances, charge in and try to disarm them, while you're executing a cut. So then your sword's not in the way to thrust them in the face. So then, having something like a dagger in your offhand gives you the advantage back. So you say, oh no, even if you're in close range, I can still kill you. And that's where two weapons can become very advantageous. So again, I reiterate the point. Having two identical weapons is a lot less useful than you'd think, because really, you've got two weapons that do the same thing. And apart from doing awkward strikes where you maybe try to use them as scissors or other motions which, to be honest, aren't very effective, having something like a knife means that your different weapons can each do some sort of role to play. It's a bit like when you've got a team. If you've got loads of the same type of person, maybe it's Dungeons and Dragons, and you've got loads and loads and loads of warriors, wouldn't it be nice if you actually swapped one of those warriors for a wizard? The same concept applies here. You don't want your tools in each hand to do exactly the same purpose. Nobody goes around with 2 mobile phones, or 2 wrenches, or 2 pistols. It's just silly. Instead, you want to have one item that does one thing, and one item that does another thing. Even if it's not necessarily a weapon per se. Something like, of course, shields are the clear example of that. But other items, such as lanterns to light up the area, items like perhaps parrying daggers, which might not necessarily even be sharp, but just help you to do that defense and take a thrust offline, those items are useful. So you could be out of range to do something like stab with a dagger, but by using it defensively, you're showing that your tool can do, in your left hand does one thing, and then you execute your thrust with the tool in your right hand. So in that case, it's very advantageous. Beyond that, in terms of actual treatises, again, you're not going to get nearly as much information looking at things like 2 weapons of any kind than you'll get on things like 2-handed swords, spears, poleaxes, sabres, you name it, those kinds of things, where it's single weapon or weapon and shield. But there are historical manuals that do show how to use multiple weapons. Most famously, you've got things like sword and dagger, especially rapier and dagger. But you've got other things as well. Indeed, there are 2 sword styles. There are things like sword and cloak is an interesting one. So again, the cloak is something that you wouldn't think, unless you pull it around someone's neck and strangle them to death, it's not something you'd think is a weapon. But having something like a cloak in your offhand can mean that you can cover your opponent, like a Retiarius throwing his net over the other person. Or indeed, you can just use it as a defensive item. A thick cloak can be enough to turn aside a sword strike, especially in a real fight where you're not necessarily delivering all the heaviest and mightiest blows all the time. You've got to be doing things like jabs, slice up the arms and do things like that. And having something like an item of clothing just over your off arm means that it's no longer going to be dangerous to put that arm in front to cover you. And it's an instinctive reaction sometimes. I used to do it as a bad habit, so I could be fighting with an arming sword, and instead of putting the sword in a way, I habitually would put my left arm in front of me, and boy did that hurt. But having something like a coat wrapped over my arm is perfectly legitimate. And indeed, if I've seen certain fights in real life where people have had things like machetes or sticks and have been fighting each other in various less economically developed countries, and one thing I noticed is that although sometimes you'd see them doing things like trying to chop each other up with machetes and staying barely in measure and often going out of measure, because of course they don't want to take the risk and get cut up, they just want to try and get away with a cheap hit and that's it, because it's hard to get medical treatment for your injuries, even if you're trading a leg hit for a split head, still undesirable. But then you can have something like an ordinary coat, something anyone can have access to, wrapped around your arm, and then suddenly you've got a significant advantage, and without spending much money. So again, that concept comes handy where you've got 2 items. They're not equal, they're not identical items, but one serves one purpose and the other serves a different purpose. Another thing you could do perhaps is if you're going to be dual wielding items like swords, you could perhaps have an item like a falchion, which, to those who don't know, imagine a machete with a crossguard and a pommel. That's basically a falchion. So it's something that's got a broader, choppier blade. It's not heavy as such, it's not something you bash around with, but it's something that's got a nice blade that's good for cutting things open, doing draw cuts and slices, and just doing chops to maybe try to decapitate or delimb someone. But then, in the other hand, perhaps have something like an estoc, or basically some sword that's dedicated for thrusting. So here we see 2 swords, so it's a dual wielding of swords, fairly similar-ish weapons, except one's good for doing cutting motions, and the other is good for thrusting motions. Now I'd argue that could act as a superior style over something like an arming sword, which is fairly balanced between cut and thrust, because a single weapon like that is, as the phrase goes, a jack of all trades, master of none. It cuts okay, it thrusts okay, but you're either going to end up specialising in one style, specialising in the other style, or having that kind of awkward balance where it's okay at both, but not really good at either. So you can see where this is going. You can have one sword that's really good at cutting. Oh boy, you make one slice with that, and that's going to be a nasty injury. And then you have another sword in the other hand, doesn't matter which way round, and then suddenly that sword is really good at thrusting. So then you can just do one little poke, and hey, that's going to be going through the in between the rings and mail armour, perhaps puncture right through a gambeson, or maybe even find purchase around in the gaps of plate armour. And then suddenly you've got two swords that each do different nasty purposes. And your opponent has to think a lot harder now. He's thinking that this person's doing the cuts and that this person's doing the thrusts, and has to think around that. Which of course is even better than just having one sword that sort of does both purposes. So those are my thoughts on dual wielding. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll see you on the next broadcast on the PC Genie's Wishmaker. Goodbye.